Okay, good evening, everyone. You can hear me okay? Good. My name is Joe Houlihan. I run the military history talks here at the BRLSI. I'm really glad to welcome you here tonight for the third in our series of talks about the Korean War, which we've been calling the Forgotten War, and it's often called the Forgotten War. I'm glad we haven't forgotten it here because we've had really good attendance for all three talks, including many familiar faces tonight. So I'm really grateful to you all for being here, and I'm grateful to those who are joining us to watch online as well, of whom there are quite a few. So tonight's talk, David Verghese is a naval researcher and biographer covering the period 1900 to 1970. He's a good friend of the BRLSI and has given some really wonderful talks here in the past, and it's lovely to welcome him back. Of the 33 naval biographies he has penned of Royal Navy sailors, 2 of them involved men who fought in the naval campaign of the Korean theatre, and he will duly be calling upon their experiences in tonight's talk. The Korean War was mainly a land war, fought under the flag of the United Nations, and I'm conscious that in our first 2 talks, which last week's was about a very specific battle involving the so-called Glorious Gloucesters, and the first week was a talk about the origin of the Korean War, why it happened in the first place. But we've never really had an overview of what happened in the land war, so David has kindly suggested that he will do that briefly at the start of this talk. There will be the first few slides will be on that subject. And then he will dovetail into the Commonwealth Naval Forces doctrine and precise roles over the 3 years of the war. So please join me in welcoming David Verghese.
Thank you, Joe, for those very kind words of introduction. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Yes, it is more, in fact, than a forgotten war. It's a war that's been totally neglected and ignored, possibly because it fell between the end of the Second World War and the US-dominated Vietnam War. But it's a war we shouldn't forget. Over 1,000 British servicemen, I believe, died in this war. More than 2,000 Commonwealth servicemen, mainly army people, were also killed. It also happened in my lifetime, and it's something I don't want to forget. Now, we've just passed the 75th anniversary of the beginning of the war, and just to reinforce his point about it being forgotten, regular scanning of the Radio Times by myself yielded absolutely nothing on it. No programs on the radio or the TV at all. In fact, most people's idea of the Korean War, they got from the TV program MASH all those years ago. Fantastically, people are nodding, very funny film and a great TV series. But it was a very serious war. As Joe said, fought under the UN flag. And it was important because it was the first conflict of the nuclear age. And we'll learn tonight, just very briefly, how close we came to a nuclear confrontation. So, if I move on, let's have a look at a little bit of the background. Now, Francis Pike covered this in his talk, but I'm only going to have a couple of lines on it. But basically, Korea became literally a colony of Japan back at the turn of the century, in 1910. And at the end of the Second World War, the Allies were victorious, and they declared what was called the 38th parallel between the two countries. Now, this parallel, it was I wouldn't call it an imaginary line, but it was a line on a map decided by 2 colonels, Colonel Stonestreet and Colonel Dean Rusk in 1945. No input from the Korean people or the Korean government at all at the time. Having decided that, the country became independent of Japan. Japan had lost the war in the Far East, and it was decided that north of the 38th parallel would be a communist ideology-led country under its leader Kim Il-sung, and the south would be a US protectorate under really the guise of five-star General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, who was based in Japan. He would be responsible, or his forces, for the defense of South Korea if it was ever needed. The South Korean president was Syngman Rhee. Rhee himself wanted to unify the country, but under the southern rules of civilization. Kim Il-sung wanted to unify the country under a communist doctrine. So you can see this clash of the ideologies right at the time that the world was being halved into the capitalist West and the communist Soviet bloc dominated with China, the other half of the world. In the period 1945 to 1950, the Stalinist regime built up the North Korean army, as I put here. It was equipped with modern tanks and artillery, trained in their use by Soviet advisors. And in South Korea, most of the troops had been withdrawn by mid-1950 when this war began, and the National Army was quite lightly armed because the military dogma was that if South Korea was ever threatened by a potential enemy, US forces in Japan would come to their aid, mobilize quickly and defend the country. Well, as I put down the bottom there, war came to Korea without warning. Even Stalin was surprised. He was aware of what might have been building up, but it came very quickly on a Sunday morning, June the 25th, 1950, when the North Korean People's Army launched this massive attack of 20 divisions, I think it was, over the 38th parallel. Took the South completely by surprise. And it had been a very calm situation up to the day before. Sunday morning, most of the US forces were either celebrating Sunday under a Christian practice. They had shut down their radar stations. The radio stations were all off. That's the military radio stations. But North Korea attacked. And it reminded me at the time, well, I was too young at the time, but it reminds me of another attack against US forces 8.5 years previously. That was also on a Sunday morning that took the US by surprise. By mid-afternoon on the 25th, that first day of the war, North Korean forces were 10 to 15 miles across the border, the whole width of it. As they headed southwards, the UN Security Council met and passed a number of resolutions. And the reason why they were able to pass them was that the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council. Sorry, I must keep the microphone. Was boycotting it, and a number of resolutions, which I'll show you shortly, were passed very quickly. If I go to the next slide. So there's the 38th parallel. And after a coordinated artillery and mortar barrage right along there, the infantry divisions and armoured brigade and other units moved across the whole of the 150-mile parallel, from the Yellow Sea to the Sea of Japan. Their forces included 150 Russian-built T-34 tanks. Now, this was probably the best tank of World War II. It was proven. The North Koreans had them for quite some time and had been trained, as I said, by their Soviet advisors, and they were very adept at using them in the foothills of the very mountainous Korean geography. What was facing them? South Korea had 4 understrength infantry divisions and a lightly armed mechanized brigade. It was no contest, really. There's a T-34 tanks, and that is a picture of the North Koreans, fairly smart, marching across the border, marching towards Seoul. Seoul is the sort of bottom left of the map there, the capital of South Korea. There's some dates there. 25th they attacked, 27th the government left and moved southwards. Northern forces moved down very fast, and the light American forces on duty in Korea, it was an occupation army really, fell back to what's called the Pusan perimeter in the southeast. We'll look at that later on the map. In fact, let's make ourselves familiar with the map of Korea, the geography of it. It's about 600 miles north to south and 150 miles typically east to west. Below the capital, Pyongyang of the north, and Wonsan on the other side, on the right-hand side, it narrows to about 100 miles wide. And in the north, there are 2 rivers separating North Korea to China, and they're important, the Yalu and the Tumen. There's a small border there, top right, with the Soviet Union, not far from Vladivostok. I'll use Fahrenheit. Temperatures varied tremendously on the Korean peninsula. In the summer, it could be 105 degrees Fahrenheit. In the winter, it would go down to minus 40. So the troops had to fight in a very widely varying temperature. Much of the country has fairly rugged mountain terrain, which extends right to the coast. You'll see this in some of my photographs later on. Didn't favour really Western tank movement. In the Second World War, they'd been used to driving their tanks across the plains of northern France and into Germany. Good, what I call tank country. For the Western army, mechanized armies, under the UN, it was not good tank country. And this is why the US Air Force would play a major part in fact, in destroying much of the country. So, Joe said, I'm going to cover the land war. I'm going to précis the land war over a year or so, and then slot in the naval components according to the phases of the war. Now, this is a slide. It shows you what's generally accepted to be the 4 phases of the war before military activity stopped in June 51, 1 year later, and then there was a hiatus until the armistice was signed 2 years after that. So if we look at the phases, first, I'll keep this picture up. So phase 1 is the one on the left. You can see the North Koreans have crossed that 38th parallel and are moving down at speed to the Pusan perimeter. Over a period of 10, 11 weeks, they swept right down there and swept aside the US and South Korean forces. Pusan was important because the US were able to land a relatively small amphibious force there that held that perimeter around it from the marauding forces. Phase 2, the second picture in, it's dominated by the port of Incheon. And this was the port where General of the Army Douglas MacArthur went on the offensive. It was a brilliant counterstroke, really, against all military dogma. He landed a huge force north of the North Korean forces, cutting off their supply lines completely. It was daring and risky, really. It had risk, But it worked for him. The North Koreans weren't expecting it, and he held a position south of Seoul and sent a second amphibious group up towards the north. In doing so, the North Korean positions further south began to crumble. A chap called General Walker down in Busan then reinforced the Busan perimeter such that US forces could fan out at speed and literally chase the North Koreans. 8th Army in the west and US 10 Corps in the east. It was a brilliant success. So MacArthur led them, but instead of holding at the 38th parallel, the recognized border, MacArthur didn't heed the warnings from his president, President Truman, and he went north of the 38th parallel. They landed near Wonsan on the western side, the eastern side, over on the right-hand side, and by the end of October, he had taken US forces right up to the Yalu rivers and surrounded Pyongyang. Pyongyang was threatened, and that's when the Chinese began to enter. Now, through proxies, they contacted the US government and warned that they were going to attack unless MacArthur pulled his forces back to the 38th parallel. MacArthur responded to Truman by saying the Chinese were bluffing, and he refused to give ground. Now, I've read a lot about General Douglas MacArthur. I'm not being unkind, but he was very egotistical, self-centered, and I know some of you are drawing parallels, and it's quite fair to draw that. But MacArthur had a good World War II record. When the Japanese forced him out of the Philippines, he made a speech, "I will be back," and he kept to his word. But you know, however high you are in the forces, you are answerable to your government, and MacArthur was dead set on yielding to Harry Truman. Within days, late October, early November, Red China intervened in great strength, dispatching 33 divisions across the Yalu and Yumen rivers. 33 divisions they had built up on the side. As Francis Pike said a couple of weeks ago, that must have been a real feat of logistics to get an army of that size on the border with all their artillery, their tanks, their logistics, their supplies, but they did. They did. I'd say it was an incredible feat of offensive logistics altogether, and General MacArthur refused to accept any responsibility, saying that he'd been let down by US intelligence for underestimating the threat. He had his own intelligence people in South Korea and in Japan. They took their eye off the ball for the second time. First when North Korea advanced, attacked, and second time when the Chinese came in. MacArthur then proposed that the government of National China, that's Formosa, today's Taiwan, would send their army to reinforce him. It wasn't very far away, but Truman insisted no, because he realized it would expand the war and perhaps bring in the Soviet Union. Escalation could have meant we were going to enter a nuclear war. Remember, in 1953, Russia had the hydrogen bomb as well as the Americans. It was going badly for them. Then for the US, the 10th Corps was almost completely enveloped and had to be extricated by sea, and the US 8th Army was forced back southwards over the 38th parallel. MacArthur was fired by President Truman, and General Matthew Ridgway, a well-known World War II US general, took over. He gave ground at Incheon and Seoul, and then by January 51, he at least stabilized the situation. Then we come to the last phase, the last one, phase 4. By this time, it's become a bit of a seesaw war. It's stabilized, And then from May, June 1951, you had 2 years of negotiations towards, theoretically, towards a peace treaty. But it was hampered by the North's recalcitrance and political gamesmanship. There weren't enough UN troops to go back up there. And of course, China had an infinitely potential number of extra reserve troops they could have sent down. And so, although MacArthur had wanted a direct attack on Manchuria, it wasn't going to happen. This, by the way, really frustrated the US Air Force that was huge out there and were dying for, big air battles. Well, they totally dominated the skies. So that's the land war, really, in a nutshell. 12 months of it, and then we get this 2-year period of nothing really happening. So let me go back to the beginning of the war and bring in the naval components. So we're going back to June 1950. The UN declared that an active breach of world peace. The UK Prime Minister willingly accepted that his naval forces would come under US command, and a number of Commonwealth countries also agreed to send their navies: Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Altogether, there were about 14 countries on the UN side, and other Commonwealth countries. India, for instance, sent quite a number of troops up there. It was going to work between the US Navy and the Royal Navy because they'd worked well. Well, they'd worked reasonably well in the Pacific War in 1945. US dominated completely, and the Royal Navy wasn't allowed to do too much. But they'd worked together. They understood each other's methods of signaling and the naval doctrine between them. Let's look at the Commonwealth navies and see what state they were in at this time. So, the Royal Navy, post-war, 1950, they were short of men, they were short of ships, the Navy had been run down, the ships were pretty well knackered after World War II. The fleet air arm was pretty weak, and there wasn't a lot they could call on. And that is why, for instance, people have asked me, why wasn't the battleship HMS Vanguard sent out to Korea? It had been built during the war, it had never fought. We couldn't afford the 2,200 men to man it. And so World War II gunners, who had been demobbed in 46, were called back for training. And there's a bit of a local thing here. I mentioned FB there. That's Frank Bowden. He lived in Bath. I knew the man until he passed away 3 or 4 years ago. Frank was retrained. He'd trained on HMS Nelson. He was a gunner. He was on their 15-inch guns. He retrained on 6-inch guns because they were the guns on the cruisers. The Royal Australian Navy ran. It had formed its own fleet air arm, equipped with RAF and naval planes a couple of years previously. The Royal Navy, of course, had their major base in the Far East in Singapore, one of the best naval bases in the world. And stroke of luck, around the 25th of June 1950, they were actually training on exercises with the US Navy off Korea. A chap called Rear Admiral Sir William Andrews at the time was the commander. His command ship was HMS Belfast. He had an aircraft carrier there, HMS Triumph, a cruiser, 6-inch cruiser, 6-inch guns, HMS Jamaica, and a collection of destroyers and frigates. He also had Royal Fleet auxiliary ships and a hospital ship. As I said earlier, it was only a few years since they had worked together. North Korea had a very small navy, consisting really of torpedo boats, gunboats, patrol vessels. At this point in time, they didn't have submarines, which would have been useful. Thank you. Oh, that's, as a Vice Admiral, that's William Andrews there. He did a good job out there and was promoted when he came back to the UK in late 52. So, those 4 phases I mentioned, including the immediate phase, call for a different type of naval effort. Within days, US and Fleet Air Arm aircraft had attacked a number of North Korean facilities, their bases, airfields, railway sites were important because there was an extensive railway network in North Korea, and they took out bridges, lines. The North Koreans were very adept at rebuilding their railways very quickly. They could rebuild railway junctions and miles of lines literally overnight. Might be a lesson there for a certain railway being built in this country. If this talk goes online, I could get into trouble for saying that. But and the response as the war progressed was mainly 2 aspects of naval strategy: blockade and bombardment. By blockade, I mean blockading North Korean ports where they could, send their merchant marine to restock their army. And the the UN navies were very good at doing that. So blockade and bombardment. And a good example of a blockade, in fact, it was done by the US Navy at Wonsan. They blockaded it for literally 2.5 years, the longest blockade of the 20th century, and it was very successful. Wonsan was an important port. Ironically, you may not know this, but as you know, North Korea is a very, very poor country. People live in extreme poverty, but if you are in the elite, that is the top of the army and the top of the political sort of elite there, Wonsan is full of luxurious flats and holiday resort. It hasn't been opened to Western tourists yet. It might be one day. So North Korea today, as unstable as it is and unpredictable, isn't as poor as you think if you're on the right side of the government there. And generally, I've said how small the North Korean was, but and this is one of the most important sentences I'll put in this talk, they didn't anticipate the potential of sea power that the UN had. They just hadn't considered it. They were good at laying minefields, and they sank 5 US naval ships, but not one Commonwealth or Royal naval ship was sunk in the Korean War. So, this looks at the role of the UN forces. I mentioned about blockading. Generally, the US had the East Coast and the British and Commonwealth navies had the West Coast. Not always. Sometimes ships would move to help the other one out. But they kept the opposing forces on land. There was very little movement of the North Korean forces by sea. US naval headquarters was in Sasebo in Japan. I'll throw a map up soon. And the Royal Commonwealth was in a place called Kure. We'll see on a map soon. Aircraft carriers were very important because the aircraft could bomb, as I said before, the North Korean facilities and railway lines. The Royal Navy, in fact the Commonwealth Navies, helped General MacArthur at Incheon, Operation Chromite. We had 3 of our 6-inch cruisers there protecting, screening the US naval forces, bombarding. There you go, cliff roads, bridges, all storage depots, shore batteries. They did that. And then the smaller vessels, I'll list them all shortly, they acted as an escort for the ships, for the Royal Fleet auxiliary ships. They had an anti-submarine role and an anti-aircraft role. Here's the map. You see, so in Japan, you've got Sasebo, not very far from Nagasaki, and Kure, not very far from Hiroshima, but Kure supported the Royal Navy and the Commonwealth Navies. Occasionally also went to Sasebo because it was nearer, but the US naval fleet was based there. You can see how close the Pusan perimeter is, literally 12 hours steaming distance away. If I take a quick look at the Royal Navy's contribution, you can see that most types of ships participated. You've got a list of aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, frigates and sloops. A sloop is a bit smaller than the frigate. Notice no battleships on the Royal Navy or the Commonwealth Navy side. The US Navy, by the way, our navies were dwarfed by the US Navy. They had 5 or 6 carriers there and at least 5 World War II battleships there. So, that was their prerogative. Those ships weren't all there at the same time. On the next slide, I think, I'll show the time frame. But the ships were based locally at Singapore and Hong Kong. So these are the aircraft carriers, and their first column is the name of the aircraft carrier. The second, you can see the timeline. I put in the Fleet Air Arm Squadrons on the left, and the 2 types of aircraft they mainly flew, and we'll look at those in a moment, Fireflies and Sea Furies. Let's look at some of those. HMS Triumph was on duty when the war broke and was in action by the 28th of June, attacking North Korean targets. That's a little bit on her history there. It's a light aircraft carrier known as the Colossus Class, as they all were. They were about 13,000 to 14,000 tons. If you think, I mean, I live down in Gosport, and I can walk out my door. I live opposite the naval base at Portsmouth, and there's 2 90,000-ton aircraft carriers there most of the time. HMS Theseus, there's a little bit of its history there. Nice photograph. HMS Glory, one of the naval biographies I've done was on the captain of HMS Glory when he was out in Korea. And I'll be using some of his photographs. In fact, there we are, HMS Glory, Captain Colloon. His family live in Winsley near Bath. Out there for 18 months, and that's the day he left. The whole ship turned out for him. There he is in the lower left, saying, inspecting the his men, inspecting the Royal Marines, perhaps the finest fighting force in the world. There he is being jackstayed across to a New Zealand ship. So his crew are manning the jackstay, as it's called. And there he is landing on the New Zealand ship, Rototi. HMS Ocean was our 4th carrier. Interesting history, because in December 1945, Eric Winklebrown, the finest test pilot this country's ever had, he flew 456 different types of aircraft, including many of Nazi Germany's aircraft. He landed a jet aircraft, a Gloucester Meteor, on the deck of HMS Ocean. Now, Mark Fricker, I know you're in the audience. Your father was a Fleet Air Arm pilot on that, and they must have been taking bets that there's no way the arrestor wires could halt a jet. But I tell you, Winklebrown was really, really good, and he landed on it, and he worked well. Have a look at the background behind there. You can see the mountainous, rugged country that the North Korean coastline afforded. And the North Koreans, along that coastline, had all sorts of hidden gun emplacements that could open up on the cliff, fire at the naval ships and then close up and disappear. That was in the theory. A number of them were taken out successfully by the Royal Naval ships. In terms of the fighter aircraft, the Firefly Fire, this is one of Captain Colquhoun's pictures of 817 squadron planes, and that was the fighter bomber, the Fairey Firefly. There's a note up there of its armament, two-seater plane, a pilot, an observer, bomb aimer. Hawker Sea Fury, that was a ground attack fighter, and that was the mainstay of the Fleet Air Arm in 1950. We hadn't got any jets at the time that were stationed in the Fleet Air Arm. There's another picture of HMS Ocean's Sea Furies. That's armament there. You'll notice in blue, I put there that some of these Fireflies downed a MiG-15 in the war. And it's true, a propeller aircraft shooting, 3 or 4 of them in the flight, shooting down a North Korean MiG-15, and quite a celebration was made of that. However, sometimes things went wrong. And this is a shot on HMS Ocean. I don't know if anybody here has been in the Fleet Air Arm, but I've often lectured on it. So you can see the deck is pretty busy. Towards the back, our aircraft parked up. Some of them might have been pranged, but you can see in the middle of the picture an aircraft that's pranged. It's missed its arrestor wires and has crashed into them. Now, on the right-hand side there, the pilot is slinking off, probably feeling a bit ashamed of himself. But look at the body language of the ratings. They're probably muttering about the officer corps. I've looked at this picture several times. I understand most of it. But look at the chap in the middle. I have no idea what a man with a watering can do in a situation like that. It's most strange. By the way, when these aircraft crashed, they were pushed over the side. And on my computer, which I've got with me, I've got pictures of all 4 aircraft carriers pushing propeller-driven aircraft over the side because they were so badly damaged. Okay, moving away from aircraft carrier, everyone's favourite ship, HMS Belfast. I'm sure many of you, like I have visited the ship a number of times on the River Thames. But you'll see she carried 6-inch main guns and 4-inch anti-aircraft guns. She was out there for 2 years. 404 days on active patrol. Here's a statistic. She fired 8,000 shells. Several times her gun barrels had to be replaced at Kure, or even on HMS Tyne, repaired some of her anti-aircraft guns. The American Navy was very, what's the word I want? They were very proud of her, actually, for being one of the best shooting ships, they called it, in the UN Naval Force. And by the time she got back home to Portsmouth, she'd sailed 97,000 miles, just existing on normal maintenance in Hong Kong and Kure. That's how good that ship was. A lovely picture of her. That's her main 6-inch guns, the 2 turrets there. There's 1 turret at the back. Some shots of her in the war. There she is firing her guns. Again, the top one is her 6-inch guns. On the bottom left is her 4-inch guns. And there she is having a bottom scraped in Kure's dry dock. Kure and Sasebo, this is only 5 or 6 years after the end of World War II. They were pretty battered, but the Japanese dock workers just came to the fore and really helped the UN forces there service and repair the ships. The dockyard workers are very good. There's a lovely picture of HMS Belfast in her latter days there. Again, you can see the mountainous countryside behind there. I'll now look at the cruisers, and you've got this colony class of cruisers. There were 3 of them there, HMS Jamaica, Ceylon, and Kenya. So I've got some dates on there, but the most important thing is their main guns. Like Belfast, they carried 9 6-inch guns and similar main anti-aircraft guns. The dates that they were out there. Jamaica had the nickname the Galloping Ghost because 3 times the North Korean people's, whatever, news bulletins claimed that she'd been sunk. Of course, she never was. Literally 1 week into the war, Jamaica, a US destroyer, and HMS Black Swan, which was a sloop, were attacked by 6 North Korean Navy boats. No contest. Jamaica and a colleague sank 5 of them, and 1 of them was damaged when it ran aground. That was really the last effort by the North Korean Navy we're speaking about. Here's some nice shots of them, Ceylon above, HMS Jamaica below. That looks as if it's in Hong Kong harbour. The ships would rotate and go back to Hong Kong for rest and recuperation, R&R they called it. There's Ceylon in dry dock, in Kouré for repair, probably a similar dock to where Belfast was. HMS Kenya at the time when she was out there, handsome looking ship. HMS Newcastle. She had a very active World War II, and she was Rear Admiral's flagship in Korea. Her gun power remained a vital threat to the North Koreans throughout the time of the armistice negotiations. She stayed out there on guard duty on a just-in-case basis. There's Newcastle's guns going off against a troublesome battery in North Korea. If I look at the destroyers, we had what's called the CO class, and I list all their features there, held about a crew of about 200, and she had depth charges. Single depth charges that could be tossed overboard. Remember, at this point, the North Koreans didn't have any submarines, but there was always the threat of Chinese submarines. And another Royal Naval destroyer was put on standby in the UK, HMS Broadsword. And I know that one of the online audience who spoke to me last week, his father was on broadside, but it wasn't called out. Broadsword had what was called a squid system of depth charge firing. I'll show you a picture in a moment or two. But she wasn't called out, Graham, if you're listening, because the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal New Zealand Navy, the destroyers they had were equipped with squid, and that fulfilled the anti-submarine role should the Chinese submarines be deployed. The destroyers could also minesweep. We couldn't spare any minesweepers out there, any specific minesweepers, but they could do that. Then there was the frigates and sloops, 6 and 7 of them. You'll recognize the name Amethyst, maybe, from the 1949 incident in China, not too far from Shanghai, on the Yangtze River. They were small ships. It could easily get into the into the Korean creeks where North Korean forces might be hanging out. And towards the bottom of both, I say what they did: anti-submarine patrols, coastal patrols, anti-aircraft. Did a little bit of coastal bombardment, etc. And here's a picture of some of them. And that's HMS Mounts Bay on the left, the Bay class. She had Bofors. Bofors was one of the best anti-aircraft guns of the Royal Navy throughout the war and in the Korean War. You've got some Brides Bay on the right, and at the bottom you've got Mounts Bay guns being repaired on HMS Tyne, which was a repair ship. When those guns were used a lot, they could quickly wear out, the barrels could become defective. So having a repair ship on hand really helped. Cardigan Bay, there's a line from her ship's log there that she rescued a pilot of a crashed aircraft south of Chodo. I'm just putting the name JJ there. If there's time in the discussion, I'll tell you about JJ, because he currently lives in the Bath area. That's all I'll say for the moment. So let's not forget the Royal Fleet Train. The Royal Fleet Train are those supply ships that have to support a naval force. And they performed much better in this war than they did in the British Pacific War, which basically started in January 1945, because they were allowed a free hand to support the Royal and the Commonwealth Navies. And despite the threat of it, there was no enemy North Korean Air Force or Chinese Air Force that could interfere with the supply ships. There were no Chinese submarine attacks, and therefore they didn't need to have high speeds. They could chunder along from Korea, from Sasebo, from Hong Kong, from Singapore, continually supplying the Royal Navy with its supply of fuel, spare parts, armaments, etc. And I list the tankers here at first, their names, their size, and the odd little note about them. They did a good job, and the Royal Fleet auxiliary supply ships never get the publicity that they deserve. And I know there's at least one man in the audience who was an RFA veteran, but not at this time. He will certainly agree with my comments, I'm sure. These are the tankers in the fleet train carrying the fuel. Some of them were fitted for replenishments at sea. You can just look at them. I just want to give credit and credence to them. Other ships in the fleet train are listed there, what they did, stores and victualling. HMS Tyne, I mentioned, was a repair ship, and HMS Maine was a hospital ship. I'll say a few words about that later. So there's some of the one of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary replenishing an aircraft carrier and a Canadian destroyer, Nootka, in 1952, replenishing on both sides. It was a skill that they really developed well in the Royal Navy. HMS Maine, the hospital ship, it was captured in World War II. It was an Italian liner transporting troops. HMS Hawkins took it as a prize. I'm sure you've all heard of naval prizes. It was converted to an army hospital ship. Then it became a navy ship, a navy hospital ship, renamed Maine. And its job really was to take out UK casualties and get them back to Korea or Sasebo for hospitalization. That's the end of the Royal Navy. Let's look quickly at the Royal Australian Navy. So on the left, I've got the names of the ships. Second column is the type of ship, and you can see the time periods that were out there. And the dates in heavy bold represent the beginning of the war when the Australian ships were out there. They responded very, very quickly to sail up once the UN had passed its resolutions. Picture of the aircraft carrier they had. This was HMS Sydney. It was a Majestic class. They were slightly bigger than the Colossus class, sold to Australia by the UK government in 1947. It had a better flight deck than the Royal Navy ships and better habitability, especially to cope with the extremes of temperature there out on the Korean peninsula. Nice picture of the ship on the right. I think it looks very modern for its time. It had Firefly aircraft. And there's a picture of her Fireflies flying over it in fairly peaceful time. That's the ground attack plane that was on all the 5 aircraft carriers. The Fireflies were actually loaned to Australia by the Royal Air Force. The Royal Air Force weren't really represented in Korea. It was too far for them. They had some Sunderland flying boats and they had some search and rescue planes, but they didn't participate. The American Air Force dominated the UN side of the air war. They had destroyers, Anzac, it's a typical one, named after the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, commissioned, which was a brand new ship, commissioned in 1951. And she separated herself from the Royal Navy ships by having red kangaroos painted on both sides of the bows, so the Americans could at least identify her. She had this squid anti-submarine mortar. Now then, imagine you're an enemy submarine and you're trying to fire your torpedoes at a Royal Navy or Commonwealth destroyer. The destroyer captains were very skilled, they could evade, and the destroyers would pass harmlessly. Then, as a submarine, you were at a disadvantage against one of these, because these were radar-controlled depth charges. They fired about 10 to 20 seconds apart. If you're a submarine trying to dive very quickly, you've got 3 of these things coming at you within 1 minute. You were going to lose that submarine. Okay. HMS Tobruk, battle class destroyer. Got a note on it here. She served as a screen with 2 Canadian destroyers for one of the US Navy aircraft carriers. That's the battling Bataan. You can see the Korean coastline behind her. In fact, on August 1st, 1950, Bataan was patrolling in the northern approaches to the Seoul River when she was fired on by a disguised shore battery. She turned around, responded with the 4.7-inch guns, and took the battery completely out. HMS Warramunga was another Australian ship. Picture of her there. She fought with HMS Belfast. I'll give you an example. February 51, Belfast and Warramunga followed a path of 23 miles in front of them, sweeping mines. The mines were swept by US minesweepers ahead of them, and they went into the port of Wonsan on the other side of Korea, one of the few times that the Royal Navy went in on the other side. And they destroyed a number of gun batteries, and then Belfast opened up on ammo dumps, oil tanks, and various military targets for 12 hours. The US Air Force were overhead, identifying the targets, and Belfast responded with all 12 of her 6-inch guns. What's that one? Those were frigates in the Australian Navy, 4 of them, and one of them took part in the Han River encounter. So this is an encounter between, on our side, an Australian frigate, a Royal Navy frigate, and a South Korean frigate. The Han River was north of Seoul, and it was well protected by North Korean gun batteries, lots of creeks and things like that. But those 3 ships went in, tackled the North Koreans, who lost 40 men, but Murchison got damaged quite badly with men wounded. It was decided then to stop any patrols in the rivers. As ships, if you think of the armistice experience in 1949 on the Yangtze, we stopped sending patrols up the rivers. You know, you've got to have a large offensive force. Rivers are easy to defend. The advantage is with the defender. And so no more patrols up rivers went on after that. So that was the importance of the Han River encounter over 3 days. The Royal Canadian Navy, they were headquartered in two places, Esquimalt on the Pacific coast and Halifax on the Atlantic coast. You'll see on the left-hand slide, 3 of those Canadian destroyers were right in the war at the beginning. They're the ones in bold. They continuously rotated between Canada and the Korean theatre until actually 1955. They divided their theatre of war between east and the west coast of Korea, and their operations typically were shore bombardment, supporting amphibious landings, including Incheon, resupplying Allied forces and villages on coastal islands, and just general maritime patrol and interdiction of any patrol boats coming out from North Korea. So the Canadian Navy played its part, certainly. There's a nice picture of one of them refueling at sea, and they're moving at speed, but that refueling is being done well. It's one good thing that the Royal Fleet Auxiliary were good at, and that was refueling our warships. And there, at the end of the war, those 4 tribals went back to Halifax. 3 of them were built, by the way, at Vickers Armstrong on the Tyne. We had some Loch-class frigates up there. This is now the Royal New Zealand Navy. I've listed them all there. There's a picture of some of them in action. Picture speaks 1,000 words. I won't say any more. They had Loch-class frigates, which were probably our best class of frigates at the time. And you can see they had the squid depth charge throwers as well. So hence HMS Broadside wasn't needed. Nice picture there of Pukaki, one of them. And there's the New Zealand force of frigates returning in 1953 to New Zealand. And some of those ships then went back to the Royal Navy or the Canadian Navy. So, I covered the Navy in a bit more detail than the military side of it. But let me summarize. Are we doing for time? Yes, okay. Let me summarize. Navy out there, there were no spectacular sea battles as there was in the Second World War. It was arduous and unspectacular. It was boring at times. Hence, the ships were constantly rotated to Hong Kong and Japan for rest and recuperation. I talked about the blockading before, etc. We protected the carriers. Don't forget, the Royal Navy in particular, I just focus on the Royal Navy a bit, and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. They had ongoing responsibilities elsewhere in the war. We had a huge naval base in Singapore. There was military operations in Borneo, military operations in Malaya against the communists, and the Royal Navy had to be there. We maintained a fleet in the Mediterranean based upon Malta. And of course, there was the home fleet as well, although not very large. But overall, as I put there in that sentence, there was no challenge to UN command of the sea, neither North Korea or the Chinese. And I thought hard about this statement, but I think it's the most powerful statement of my talk tonight. If you don't mind, I'll just read it to you. The Korean War restated the ancient truth. Remember, the Navy had been around for 300 years, that sea power is Britain's, or was Britain's, most useful strategic asset to allies in the time of potential war. Notice I've used the past tense, was, rather than is. I live opposite the main base down at Portsmouth. Apparently there's some village called Plymouth over to the west, but they have ships. But I don't think we could fulfill that last sentence now. I really don't think. I can see one of you, 2 of you, nodding in the audience. We have run our Royal Navy down for the umpteenth time. The Cameron government in particular was Navy blind. You know, they got rid of the Sea Harriers, they got rid of the Harrier carriers. we were left bereft of naval air power until HMS Queen Elizabeth not just came on board in August 2017, by the time her pilots were trained on those F-35Bs, it was another 3 years. We were 9 years bereft of naval air support. And I think that's a terrible indictment of our military forces. Perhaps many of you don't agree with me. Remember, Bath had a huge history with the Navy. The Admiralty were here in the war, and some of you might have attended my talk last year. Anyway, I digress. Lessons from the war. The rapid post-World War II rundown was slowed, and to some extent it was reversed. Aircraft carriers became the fore. HMS Victorious went through an 8-year refit, very, very expensive redesign. Hermes and Ark Royal were updated tremendously. New jet aircraft came into service. And it also showed that the Commonwealth Navies could work together with the US Navy, a precursor of future maritime, North Atlantic maritime operations. Comment there in the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. Concluding with comments on the war, I'm coming to an end, Joe. We never signed a peace treaty, or the Koreans didn't. It was a stalemate the last 2 years. But unification was not attained by North Korea. It stopped the Stalinist North forcing its will on the South. Last time it was a British Commonwealth force fought together. Will we ever get a peace treaty? I don't know. But President Truman had always maintained that it was direct communist aggression. And he maintained that communist aggression came from Stalin, who of course denied these things at the time. And then once the Berlin Wall had come down and communism and the Russian Comecon, etc., had run down, US historians went into Moscow, looked at files, and they found that everything was done with Stalin's knowledge, approval, and direct military aid. These are the references I've used for this talk, and Catherine Weathersby, a team from one of the US universities, looked at those files in '93. That's my talk finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm sorry about the noise outside towards the end. I hope it's not too hot to have closed the windows, but I thought we probably could manage. I'm not sure what building work is going on at this time, but whatever. So please, if you have any questions, raise your hand. Okay, first question here. Please hold the microphone close to your lips.
My next door neighbour is 95, and we're constantly wondering how long he's going to hang on to, but he seems to survive all sorts of bashings. He did his national service just after the Second World War in far-off Staffordshire, but he did talk about having to be called back at some stage after his national service ended. So I suppose we were looking at about the time of the Korean War. I mean, what recall was there of reserve and former national servicemen during that period?
Well, I'll answer that in two sort of sub-phases. Certainly, much of the UK army that was in Korea, much of the Navy were conscripts, that is, men called up on national service. And they were called up, rapidly trained, sent off to the Far East, to a country called Korea that they had never heard of. It isn't even well known now. And then ongoing from 1953 to 55, there was a feeling in the West that perhaps the stalemate wouldn't hold. So more people were put on standby. And I mentioned about Frank Bowden, the local guy, being retrained. So certainly your friend could well have been put on standby, When you're demobbed from the Army and the Navy, you are put theoretically into the reserve at this time in the 1950s. So yes, what he described to you in his musings of going back was typical.
Okay, David, a question from Duncan Young online. How was target intelligence gathered within the Royal Navy Commonwealth ships, or was it all from the USA? And how was it disseminated?
Okay, that's a good question. Limited target identification could be done by the Fleet Air Arm planes operating off the coast, so much inland. But the US Air Force dominated much of both Koreas, especially the South, and they provided a lot of ongoing intelligence as to where North Korean forces were, especially in the 1950 to 51 period. And that enabled naval guns to be vectored in accurately. And Belfast, well, in fact, all our cruisers were very good at that. Remember, the Navy had 300 years of gunnery skills, and they were pretty good.
Okay, any more here in the room? Yep, at the back.
It's also about gunnery. The Vanguard didn't go out there because the Americans did have their battleships there and could therefore provide 16-inch firepower and gun support. That had been very important for any kind of warfare in the Second World War, the landings, in the Italian landings too. But how important was that kind of firepower for this conflict? How much difference does the American capability make in the Korean conflict?
Yes, I thought this might come up. I've not studied in any detail the US naval forces, but they were huge compared to the Commonwealth. I mentioned before 5 or 6 aircraft carriers, 5 or 6 battleships. They had an immense number of cruisers, destroyers, and other ships, submarines as well. And they would have done a lot of targeting, helped by their Air Force as well, of especially North Korean army columns coming down and all those railway junctions, oil depots, etc. Perhaps in time, if I have the time, I will look at the US naval component of it, but it was much bigger than the Commonwealth, as you'd expect. Much of the damage to the Koreas was in fact done by the US Army Air Force or the US Air Force. They dominated the skies and they let loose terribly. I mean, over 2 million Korean civilians were killed in that war, and much of it was due to bombing. It was a war that the participants on the Western side perhaps could not be proud of in terms of the damage to civilians.
Thank you, David. Another question from online. I'm going to paraphrase it. Given what you said about the fact that there weren't major naval engagements, as in the Pacific War, how is the Royal and Commonwealth Navies' participation in Korea seen in those navies now? Is it something that's a big part of, they feel as a big part of their history and legacy, or is it forgotten there as well?
Yes, that's a good point the person's made. I think I mentioned that this war is one that's been neglected, one that's been ignored, and it's relatively forgotten in Royal Naval terms. So all the Royal, I must have 150 Royal Naval books. Much of them focuses on World War II and World War I. There's very little on the Royal Navy in the Korean War. If I can go back, I think that goes backwards. Oops, daisy. Yes, that first reference there, Naval Staff History, that covers the Royal Navy in depth, and it's a fairly forgotten book. I've got it, and in fact, much of it is a cure, if you read it, is a cure for insomnia, because there was nothing spectacular. You're bombarding, you're patrolling, you're going for rest and recreation, etc. Yeah. So to answer it, pretty well forgotten and not particularly remembered by the Royal Navy in its, they don't have them anymore, Royal Navy days. I'm not aware of anything regularly done by the Royal Navy to commemorate the Korean War. But I would, if I could do, I mentioned, I've got time, JJ, because it's got a local, and this will help answer the question about national servicemen. Could I just cover this?
Please, go ahead.
So I mentioned a chap on HMS Cardigan Bay, and the one line was, a pilot, a US pilot, was rescued. He'd been shot down. The person that affected this, or took part in this battle, was a very good friend of mine. He's much older than me. He's 91 now, and one of the nicest blokes I've ever met. So is it Wednesday night? Yes. He may well be having a drink in the Dog and Fox in Bradford-on-Avon at the moment, because you often found him there. And Jim Johnson, and he'll hate me for telling you this, these are his words. I wrote his naval biography. He was called up to Korea as an 18-year-old national serviceman. He didn't know where the country was. Sent out to Singapore, then whipped up to Korea on HMS Cardigan Bay. And these are his words when I wrote his biography. He dictated them to me. The most exciting thing that happened to me was one day we went to action stations. 2 Chinese MiG-15 fighters were chasing a couple of American propeller-driven Corsairs. The MiGs shot down one of the Corsairs and the pilot was killed. And then they both pursued the remaining one. We've got 2 MiGs now chasing a propeller aircraft. The MiGs were much faster than the prop Corsair, and one of the tailing MiGs fired on it. With its much faster speed, it then dipped under the Corsair and then shot up in front of it. The American pilot could not believe his luck. He had about 2 seconds to act. He fired his cannons, it was a fluke, and the MiG-15 exploded. The remaining MiG then got more cautious, but it was no contest. He shot down the second Corsair within half a minute. So all this action has taken about 3.5 minutes. The US pilot bailed out. By this time, the one remaining MiG-15 and the parachuting pilot were within our Bofors range as the MiG had circled around to get the American pilot. Jim Johnson was a Bofors gunner. He was 18 and a half, but he had been specially trained in operating this twin gun. He had a co-gunner with him. We didn't get the order to fire in case of hitting the parachutist, but I could see that the MiG was going to get him anyway. So I opened up with my twin Bofors. I aimed between the parachutist and the incoming MiG, and the tracers put the pilot off, that's the MiG pilot, and he veered away and left the parachutist alone, who landed in the sea. We picked up the American pilot a few minutes later. Jim Johnson had fired on his own initiative without the order. He was an ordinary seaman. He would later get promoted to leading seaman, to able-bodied seaman as a result of it. Within 25 minutes of picking up the pilot, a chief petty officer, sergeant of the arms, came down to find Johnson and told him to report to the captain's office. Jim told me, and Jim lives in Westwood Village, just outside Bradford-on-Avon, he thought he was going to be cashiered. I'm not sure that you can court-martial an ordinary seaman, but he was fearful. He went into the captain's office, saluted, marched in there, and there was the captain of the destroyer with the American pilot. The American pilot had a big grin on his face. He walked over, shook Jim Johnson by the hand, and thanked him for saving his life. With that, Jim was now thoroughly confused. He saluted to the captain and left the room. I'm the only bloke that Jim Johnson has ever told this story to, and Jim would hate me for telling you, but Jim is local, good friend of ours, and he lives in in Bradford-on-Avon. That's the second chapter. Frank Bowden lived in Bath. So it's nice to bring a bit of local things into it. But to answer your question, Jim was called up, a conscript, and trained and sent out there. I think you put some notes on the website. We lost about 1,000 British, 1,000 to 1,100 killed.
Yeah,
well, you
that's
heard last
correct.
week how many
That's correct, yeah.
were killed. The Commonwealth lost 2,000 people killed. And damn it, this is a forgotten war. We ignore all that. These men fought under a UN flag, but represented this country, and they're forgotten about.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think those personal stories kind of add a dimension to understanding of these big events in history that the overview doesn't always give. We've probably got time for one question, if anyone has one last very quick question. First, sir.
How on earth did Britain afford to go to this war? Here we were bankrupt after World War II, and yet 5 years later, we were fighting another conflict on the far side of the world.
Yes. I've often wondered that. You're right. We were bankrupt. We were existing on the US Marshall Plan, as you know, putting millions of dollars in. But defense was important then, and we had to play our part in the UN. We were on the Security Council, the very top of it, never mind all the levels below it. The UN could not afford, in terms of diplomacy, theoretically, to avoid going there. So the money was found, and you saw from my slide on the lessons learned, lessons were learned, which probably saved money in the big picture in the end. The money was found. We couldn't afford to send battleships. Only 4 cruisers went out, but it was found. There's always reserves somewhere. And it was money well spent, really.
And about 15 years later, I think we declined the invitation to take part in the Vietnam War. So perhaps that was not just political, but also financial. And
that's a very important point you just made. You know, in 1963, President Kennedy put a lot of pressure on Lord Douglas Hume, the Prime Minister at the time in '63, to enter that war and to allow the Americans use of the naval base at Singapore. And then the pressure came, in particular, from President Johnson on Harold Wilson, and he also fought against it and declined. So you're right, Joe, yeah.
Right, so I'm sorry we've gone on a bit late, and I'm sorry for the staff, I have to clear up now, but thank you all very much for coming. Please join me in a final round of applause for David Verghese.